Hi, I'm Bill Cullina. I'm the Executive Director here at the Morris Arboretum, and I wanted to do a short video today to talk about something that just happened this week, which is a little unusual. We're starting to get questions about it. We had a very warm March, kind of a cool April, but things are a couple weeks ahead of where they normally are, and we got a fairly hard freeze twice in the last week. Temperatures went down to below 30 degrees, and we're seeing some widespread damage on certain trees, particularly. This only happens, fortunately, maybe once every 10-15 years or so, but it can be fairly traumatic depending on the species. So I wanted to show you some examples, talk about what you can do to help the trees through this trauma and hopefully get back to health again. Well, the tree that was directly behind me is a Amur makya, Makya amurensis, and I think it's pretty obvious here that most of this tree's new growth was frosted off. There's a few live leaves. I would say this tree's lost 90% of its canopy. So the problem is it takes a lot of energy for these deciduous trees to leaf out in the spring, and basically all that energy to manufacture those new leaves, not to mention all those buds that were formed over the winter time, have been lost through this cold. Now, trees have the reserves, if they're healthy, to weather this kind of thing, but just like when you're sick, if you come down with an illness, you recover from that, you're in a weakened condition, and there's things you can do to help that tree recover. If you look carefully down here, you can see there are some dormant buds that haven't broke. These buds broke, and this tissue probably is all going to die and be dropped off. So the tree does have backup buds that will resprout and regrow the canopy in short order. So by June, the damage here won't be so obvious to see, but the damage will be obvious when you think about the reserves the tree has. If you watched my video on removing lanternfly eggs, this is the tree I was showcasing there. This is a Styrax japonicus, Japanese snowbell tree, and this one got hit pretty bad too. Again, I would say it's lost 75% of its foliage, maybe 80%, and really most of its flowers this year too. So it will leaf out again, but its reserves are severely depleted. So some of the things you can do to help a tree that's gone through this kind of trauma is, in the summertime, if we have dry situation, if we have drought conditions, give it some deep waterings to help it that way. Certainly some fertilizer applications this time of year around the root zone to help it regrow that canopy will be helpful too. And you'll have to wait and see. Sometimes the damage from this kind of event can take a couple years to manifest, but those things you can do to really get it through this growing season so that it can replenish those carbohydrate reserves and be ready if insect attacked or drought or another freeze like this happens again, will go a long way to making sure the tree survives and comes back stronger. We have here Camellia oleifera, which is one of the fall blooming, very hardy camellias. This is a lovely white flowered fall blooming camellia, but I think it's pretty obvious the new growth that was pretty far along there is all browned up and dead. If I look at other stems and I look at the other growth that's coming out, I would say it's lost almost all of its new flush of growth. Again, it will regrow from buds farther down. You're going to see some sort of, some twig dieback and that sort of thing. But because this is an evergreen, so it does have current year leaves that it can hold on to a little longer to help regrow its replenish its reserves and regrow its canopy. It should be in decent shape. You may find you have to do a little pruning next year, prune out some of the dead wood if it's died back. But don't expect luxurious flowering this fall, this winter, because this tree's got to focus its energy on rebuilding its supply. So after a trauma like this, typically with flowering plants, you're going to see the following year a reduction in flowering or no flowering at all as it recovers. This one surprised me. This is a one of the firs, Abies holophila from Korea and China, called Manchurian Fir. And notice here how a lot of the new growth was burned off during that frost. Not all of it. It still has some growth that survived. In fact, it were typically the new twigs that were forming that were a little less far along. Often they were the terminals, which on firs tend to open a little bit later than the laterals, where the ones were burned off. So this tree lost, I would say, 30% or so, 40% of its new growth, but has enough here to regrow. Now you think of firs as being tough mountain plants, so the idea that temperatures in the low 30s or very high 20s would do this kind of damage to it, it doesn't seem right. But what you have to remember is that winter dormancy is something that is there's basically a plant can either be dormant or it can be in growth. And so they have to lose basically the cold tolerance that they have to come back into growth, because a lot of what cold tolerance is in hardy plants is removing water from their tissues so that they can't freeze and form ice crystals. So you have that situation where they need to rehydrate and to start growing, so they basically lose their cold tolerance to be able to come into growth. This is a tree from the mountains. My guess is that where it's growing, it's the winter ends more reliably and the spring comes on more reliably, and you don't have these sort of fluctuations in temperature like this, so that it was caught off guard. There's another fir right next door, which is basically hardly even the growth yet and wasn't affected by this. Finally, here we have a Oriental Beech, and this one got lucky in that the buds were starting to elongate and starting to expand. These are bud scales. These they look like scales, and what they help is protect that developing new growth as it's coming out. Also in the bud in the wintertime, they'll slough off as the twig elongates, but this one got lucky and it was not far enough along its development that the cold really did any damage. If I kind of bend this leaf, if I bend this open and pull the scales away, you can see those beautiful new leaves in there, undamaged by the cold. Now if this frost had happened a week or 10 days after this probably would have lost a lot of its leaves, but it's just a timing thing. And every tree, every shrub basically uses a combination of temperatures, especially nighttime temperatures, and day length to gauge when it's safe to leaf out again. Depending on where the plant originated in the wild, that timing is going to be very different. So sometimes when you're bringing in especially things from other parts of the world, their timing may be a little bit off, and when you look around at what has been damaged in this cold, it tends to be more of the plants from afar. But in the case of this Oriental Beech, its timing, even though it's from halfway around the world in China, was pretty good. Growing on the arbor here is autumn sunset climbing rose, and now this rose, if you've grown roses before, you know they're fairly cold tolerant. The leaves don't seem to get too damaged by light frost and that sort of thing. This really suffered no damage at all. But I wanted to point out, you see all that beautiful red coloring in the new leaves, and as the leaves mature they lose that coloring. This red is caused by a type of plant pigment called anthocyanins, and what's interesting about anthocyanins is that they can provide some cold protection for the plant even when it is pulling itself out of dormancy. So if you look around in your own yard, you look at a lot of emerging leaves, you'll see this red color, and then when the leaf is fully mature it loses that color and turns green, and that's because the chlorophyll, that's the primarily photosynthetic pigment, has really developed in that leaf. But red leaves are very common in the spring as hardy trees and shrubs are emerging. Perennials will do that too, to confer a little bit of cold tolerance in their foliage. Finally, another frost-damaged tree. We're looking at one of the Chinese ashes, Fraxinus bungiana. See, looking at the dead flowers, also the dead leaves and twigs. It really was just starting to leaf out. So the final question you might ask, this is a younger tree. Same thing that I mentioned for the larger trees, watering it this summer if it starts to dry out, giving it some appropriate fertilizer. But you might say, do I cut this back? No, the best thing is just to leave it be. You don't know where the new buds will break on these branches. Typically it'll be right below this, the damaged growth. But next spring or in the fall as it's dying back, you can maybe do a little pruning to prune out any dead wood that shows up in there. But for now, the best thing is let it be. Hopefully it recovers. Certainly newly planted or recently planted shrubs and trees are going to be more at risk than established ones, but they too can often survive a freeze like this as long as it's a rare occurrence.